Okay, so today we're starting 4.5, the abolitionist and women's movement. The objective for today is that students will be able to explain the parallels, or also known as the similarities, between the anti-slavery and the women's rights movements. So parallel is similarities between the anti-slavery and women's rights movements. So first we're going to talk about the attitudes toward slavery and how did this attitude start to change. Well, the first issue that we saw we ran into was the issue of expansion, because it created conflict over slavery. And we saw this with the Missouri Compromise. Now, part of this conflict arose from a group called the Free Soilers. When you first read about the Free Soilers, they believed that people should be free, that free individuals. And the reason why they felt that is because they felt that if you were free, you could achieve economic self-sufficiency. So it wasn't so much that they were anti-slavery, but they really supported this economic. So supported individual economy over this idea of slavery. Now, abolitionists was the actual movement to abolish slavery. During the abolitionist movement, we saw a number of people that were very active in the movement. The first being a name of William Lloyd Garrison. That should be 2 L's. And William Lloyd Garrison was the author of The Liberator, and this was an abolitionist newspaper. The second was a man by the name of Frederick Douglass, who we see right over here. And Frederick Douglass was so important because he was an ex-slave. He was an amazing speaker. And he was the author of the North Star, which was another publication that was an abolitionist publication. We also had Sojourner Truth, who was a freed slave and also a fantastic speaker. Harriet Tubman was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by this woman right here, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the reason why Uncle Tom's Cabin was so important is because it showed the actual misery of slavery. And it gained sympathy from people up north. When President Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So you're to blame for this war." Meaning that her book gained so much support from people in the North and really outraged people in the North about the actualities of slavery. In addition to the abolitionist movement, there was an overall response to slavery in both the North and the South. So first we started to see an increase in slave rebellions that were never successful. In part because whites had guns and more people, more resources. Guns plus resources. One of the most famous was the Nat Turner Rebellion. During the Nat Turner Rebellion, 55 whites were killed. Now, this did take place in Southampton, Virginia, so it wasn't very far from us, a little further south. Another response to slavery was the Underground Railroad, and you can see a map of the Underground, or some of the Underground Railroad here, and this is where we also talked about Harriet Tubman. And that's where a small group of slaves would try to escape at a time. It also led to an issue of states' rights, and this was with John C. Calhoun. And essentially what happened was the issue over whether or not states could keep slavery. So could states keep slavery? And John C. Calhoun focused on the 10th Amendment. And if you remember back to the 10th Amendment said anything not specifically stated in the U.S. Constitution as a right given to the federal government meant the states had the right to it. And so what John C. Calhoun had said was that since the Constitution did not give the federal government the right to keep slavery, or the right to abolish slavery, states had the right to keep it. And what was interesting about this is that most Southerners actually never owned slaves, but they supported this idea of the Southern way of life. And so because they supported this idea, they were in favor of keeping slavery, even though so many of them never even owned slaves. Now, a parallel with the abolitionist movement was the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement actually gained a lot of strength and momentum because of the abolitionist movement. They learned a lot from the abolitionist movement. They followed it very closely and therefore used that as a momentum for their own movement as well. So there was a strong parallel, or again, similarity between the abolitionists and the women's rights movement. The abolitionists, or the women's movement, learning a lot from the abolitionist movement. Seneca Falls was the start of the women's rights movement. And this took place in 1848. And it was led by a woman by the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And their main goal was to fight for suffrage, and that was the right to vote. And this suffrage movement, or this right to vote movement, was led by a woman by the name of Susan B. Anthony. And eventually will lead us to the 19th Amendment, but not for some time. The 19th Amendment didn't happen until after the Civil War. And that is it for today.